Look at the global map of financial transactions. The pulse of the SWIFT network beating outward from New York, illuminating the world in a web of absolute control. Now, watch it suddenly go black. The screen is dark, but beneath the surface, billions of dollars are moving like a glowing underground mycelial network. A parallel ecosystem of wealth is transferring massive kinetic energy without leaving a single digital footprint. The world's ultimate financial surveillance panopticon has gone completely blind.
You were taught your wealth is safe, but your purchasing power, the stability of your retirement fund, and the value of the dollars in your wallet rely entirely on a monopoly that was just quietly broken. Right now, while you sleep, your savings are bleeding value. The invisible shield protecting the American economy from global inflation has been systematically bypassed. The fortress walls were not breached by armies. They were rendered mathematically obsolete without a single shot ever being fired.
I'm going to deconstruct the exact cryptographic mechanisms and geopolitical maneuvers used to hack the global financial system. The official narrative is a myth, a comforting illusion to mask a catastrophic reality. We will explore the shadow physics of money, mapping the arteries of this invisible economy. I guarantee that by understanding this new architecture, you will see the true blueprint of the impending economic world order, long before the next major market crash wipes out the unaware.
A massive, heavy steel vault door at a central bank slowly closes, completely sealing off the light. We assume that sealing the vault means total security. A fatal misconception. Deep on the ocean floor, fiber optic cables are pulsing with encrypted data, carrying the lifeblood of nations. We are witnessing the ultimate collision of eras, the physical, brute force embodiment of financial isolation crashing headfirst into the invisible, unstoppable speed of global information flow. Inside a windowless, fluorescent-lit room at the United States Treasury Department, a financial warfare analyst stares at walls covered in dead-end transactional flowcharts. To the untrained eye, it is just administrative bureaucracy. But through the analyst's eyes, this is the battlefield. He traces the missing capital, feeling the cold thrill of a hunter, slowly realizing a terrifying truth. The ghost he has been obsessively tracking through the data logs is actually the one hunting him. To understand this systemic failure, we must rewind the tape. In the year 2012, the operators of the global financial architecture made a pivotal calculation. They targeted Iranian banks and unilaterally disconnected them from the global ledger. This was not a standard economic penalty. It was an erasure from reality. It marked the very first time the nuclear option of modern finance was deployed. The target was isolated, but the unintended mutation of the system had already begun. Let us dispel a persistent illusion. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, known as SWIFT, is not a bank. It holds no money. It is simply a secure messaging system. Every single day, it processes over 42 million messages, facilitating the movement of roughly $5 trillion. It is the central nervous system of global trade, the digital highway of capitalism. And for decades, the United States firmly held the ultimate override switch to this entire network. Holding that override switch granted absolute geopolitical supremacy. You could bankrupt a nation simply by revoking its access to the conversation. Through the eyes of the Treasury analyst, SWIFT was the ultimate panopticon, a perfectly engineered choke point where every cross-border transaction was monitored, vetted, and approved.
The power to freeze an economy without deploying a single aircraft carrier seemed like the perfect, bloodless weapon. But absolute power breeds absolute overconfidence. By the year 2022, this weapon was deployed on a scale previously thought impossible. The target was Russia. Overnight, the financial override switch was thrown, instantly freezing over $300 billion in sovereign reserves. The textbook rule of deterrence was permanently broken. What was intended as a crippling blow instead acted as a global distress signal. It proved to every observing nation that dependency on the dollar was a fatal, lethal vulnerability.
You were told this freeze was a victory for the established order. The statistics lied. The analyst in that windowless room saw the immediate, terrifying blowback. When you weaponize a global utility, you destroy the fundamental trust that makes the utility function. Freezing $300 billion did not crash the targeted economy into submission. Instead, it acted as a brutal evolutionary pressure, forcing adversarial nations to rapidly mutate their own financial infrastructures.
The paradox of sanctions is that they do not isolate economies, they merely accelerate their independence. The analyst watches the dead ends on his flowcharts multiply because the capital has not vanished. It has simply migrated to a realm where his credentials hold no authority. They forced half the globe to realize that a centralized hub in New York was no longer a physical necessity for international survival. The quarantine zone became the very incubator for a new apex predator.
The sheer panic vibrates through the fluorescent lights of the Treasury Department.
The analyst understands that the global South is actively severing its nervous system from the Western brain. It is a methodical surgical procedure, executed through cryptographic ledgers and back-channel logistics. The evidence is mounting that the financial empire is not being conquered from the outside, but is being aggressively bypassed, starved of the very transaction volume it needs to breathe. This is where the counterintuitive reality hits you. The strength of the dollar was never backed by gold. It was backed by the sheer lack of alternatives. It was an enforced monopoly of convenience. But when the architects of SWIFT slammed the vault door shut, they unwittingly locked themselves inside. The fiber optic cables on the ocean floor began routing data around the blockage, proving that the flow of global capital behaves exactly like a river encountering a dam. It finds another way.
We are watching the physics of a system collapse in real time. The analyst drops his pen, looking at the silent, gaping hole in his data. The trillions of dollars moving outside his jurisdiction are not just lost revenue. They represent a fundamental rewriting of the global power structure. A shadow economy is rising, built on principles that the old guard cannot regulate, cannot trace, and fundamentally cannot stop. The weaponization of finance has triggered an irreversible chain reaction. This brings us to the ultimate, terrifying paradox of power. By trying to completely crush an adversary, the empire provided the exact kinetic energy required for that adversary to break the chains of the system entirely. We must ask ourselves the vital question as we stare into the void of this new shadow network. How exactly does squeezing your grip too tight become the precise mechanism that allows the sand to slip through your fingers? The answer lies in the architecture of the ghost ledger. You have been taught that economic isolation equals a death sentence. The official narrative insists that if you sever a nation from the global nervous system, it simply starves in the dark. But step into the suffocating heat of this crowded shipping port outside the quarantine zone. Listen to the roar of the cranes. Millions of tons of cargo are swinging through the air, loading onto massive freighters. The host is supposedly dead, yet the kinetic energy is deafening. The anomaly here is terrifying in its sheer scale. To the untrained eye, this is just routine global commerce. But if you look at the digital manifests, you realize something impossible is happening right in front of you. Not a single electronic dollar is registering on any screen. The financial radar of the United States Treasury is completely blank. The ships are full, the engines are burning fuel, but mathematically, this trade does not exist. This is a glaring glitch in the matrix of global finance. It forces a deeply uncomfortable question that economists are desperately trying to ignore. How exactly do you purchase billions of dollars in raw materials without actually spending any money? To solve this, you have to discard everything you learned in high school economics. You have to stop thinking about money as paper or digits and start understanding it purely as information. The answer is not found in a Wall Street boardroom, but underground. Deep in a makeshift server farm in a Tehran basement, the deafening hum of cooling fans masks the outside world. Through the bloodshot eyes of a blockchain architect working a double shift, you do not see despair. You see the electric realization that they are rewriting history. They're not trying to hack the American system. They are rendering it entirely irrelevant. The blueprint for this rebellion did not even originate with an enemy of the West. It started with European allies. In the year 2019, European nations attempted to circumvent United States sanctions by creating the Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges, widely known as INSTEX. The press dismissed it as a desperate political stunt. They were wrong. It was a sophisticated, high-tech resurrection of the oldest economic model in human history. The official narrative tells you that modern trade requires a centralized clearinghouse in New York. INSTEX proved this is an absolute myth. It functioned as a closed-loop barter ledger, stripping away the need for an external currency entirely. Our architect in the basement is studying this code, realizing that if you can perfectly balance the equation of supply and demand locally, you blind the global panopticon. The mechanics are ruthlessly elegant. The system matched European exports with Iranian imports internally. Let me break down the paradox. A sterile German pharmaceutical lab loads medicine destined for Tehran onto a plane. At the exact same time, a warehouse in Munich receives Iranian pistachios. The system simply pays the local pharma lab with the funds from the local pistachio buyer. The goods cross the physical border, but the wealth never leaves home. The implications of this are staggering. Because the transactions are settled domestically on both sides, not a single euro or dollar ever crossed an international border. Cut to the massive data centers of the United States Treasury. To their surveillance algorithms, the event never occurred. By refusing to transmit data through the established channels, this ghost ledger rendered United States jurisdictional tracking mathematically blind. The ultimate financial weapon was neutralized by silence. Critics love to point out that INSTEX ultimately struggled with scaling. They mock its low volume and bureaucratic hurdles, calling it a failure. This is a fatal miscalculation. You do not judge the first successful test of a nuclear chain reaction by how much power it generated for the grid. You judge it by the terrifying fact that the theory was proven true. INSTEX served as a flawless, undeniable proof of concept. The architect in that sweltering server room understands the gravity of this equation. The mathematics of clearing transactions locally proved to emerging markets a very dangerous truth. A centralized hub in New York was no longer a physical necessity for international survival. It was merely a legacy system, a bloated middleman surviving on habit and the threat of force. And in the world of technological evolution,
Middlemen are always eliminated.
Look again at those massive freighters pulling away from the docks, heavy with cargo heading into the open ocean. They are the physical manifestation of that solved equation. The resistance realized that you do not need to defeat the dollar in a head-to-head currency war. You simply need to build a parallel logistical reality where the dollar is not invited. It is a biological exploit of the global market, bypassing the immune system entirely. The countdown has already started, and the alarms in the West are ringing far too late. What began as a localized European experiment in sanctions evasion has provided the architectural blueprint for something far more predatory. If a small, isolated ledger can successfully blind the most powerful surveillance apparatus on Earth, what happens when a global superpower adopts the exact same mathematics on an industrial scale? We are watching the incubation of a financial Death Star. The ghost ledger has proven that the chains of the old empire are strictly psychological. The isolated nodes are waking up, recognizing their collective strength, and preparing to scale this untraceable barter system across continents. The monopoly is bleeding out, and the architects of the new world order are just getting started. The architects did not just build a new system. They triggered a biological mutation in global finance. You were taught in your university economics classes that a hegemon cannot be overthrown without a military conflict. The official narrative is a comforting myth. What happens when you try to amputate a diseased limb from a thriving organism? You do not kill the infection. You trigger the Hydra effect. Cut off one isolated node in Europe, and a geopolitical leviathan wakes up in the East. Step onto the floor of a frantic trading hub in Shanghai today. The air vibrates with a deafening, kinetic energy. But look closer at the glowing screens. The familiar green and red tickers of the United States dollar are vanishing. Instead, you see a chaotic, accelerating web of local currency pairs. Rubles trading directly for yuan. Rupees swapping for reals. This is not a market correction. This is the physical sensation of an alternative ecosystem achieving escape velocity. Your textbooks told you that the dominant reserve currency is an immovable object. You were programmed to believe there was no alternative to the Western financial panopticon. But following the devastating sanctions of the year 2022, the BRICS nations weaponized this arrogance. They massively accelerated their own architecture, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS. They did not just build a bridge, they constructed an entirely new continental highway. The speed of this migration is terrifying. The architects of this new infrastructure bypassed decades of slow institutional growth. Within a mere 2 years of the most severe financial freeze in history, the CIPS network was processing over 13.5 thousand transactions daily. This is not a slow leak of capital. This is a torrential flood of global wealth actively abandoning a sinking ship. The countdown to absolute irrelevance is ticking louder with every executed trade. To understand this threat, you must grasp a fundamental misconception. You think SWIFT actually moves your money. It does not. SWIFT is nothing more than a sophisticated messaging protocol. It simply sends instructions that require American correspondent banks to validate the ledger. It is a permission slip from the empire. But this new hybrid system operates on a radically different physics. It eliminates the need for anyone to ask Washington for permission to conduct business. Instead of passing notes through an American intermediary, these insurgent networks began physically settling accounts using bilateral currency swaps. It is a direct, peer-to-peer exchange of planetary wealth. If a factory in Shenzhen buys energy from Moscow,
the transaction settles in native currencies. This completely eliminates the need to purchase United States dollars as an intermediary step. The blood of global commerce is being rerouted around the necrotic tissue of the old empire.
This is the exact moment the trap snaps shut.
When you remove the mandatory conversion to dollars, you strip away the core mechanism of American financial supremacy. The shadow economy is no longer a localized barter experiment in a dusty server room. It has mutated into an unstoppable economic avalanche. Every transaction executed outside the traditional grid is a direct subtraction from the liquidity that keeps the Western world functioning. The gravity of the situation is absolute.
You're standing on the tracks, completely oblivious to the freight train accelerating toward you in the dark. The financial analysts in Washington look at their outdated models and see temporary anomalies. They are blinded by their own historical supremacy. But the mathematics of a bilateral swap do not care about geopolitical hubris. They only care about efficiency. And right now, the algorithmic efficiency of this parallel network is devouring the old order from the inside out.
The ultimate proof of this paradigm shift is written in the very fuel that powers human civilization. For half a century, the petrodollar agreement was the unbreakable bedrock of Western hegemony. If you wanted to move a single barrel of crude oil across an ocean, you had to price it and pay for it in American currency. This was not a choice. It was a global mandate enforced by the threat of total economic annihilation. But the shadow network has broken this sacred covenant. By the year 2024, the unthinkable became a documented reality. Over 20% of global oil trades were actively being priced and settled in currencies other than the dollar. 1/5 of the planetary energy market simply vanished from the traditional ledger. This shattered a monopoly that had been absolute and unchallenged since the 1970s. The structural integrity of the global financial system suffered a critical, unrecoverable fracture.
A 20% loss in the energy monopoly is not a minor fluctuation. It is a fatal systemic hemorrhage. When nations realize they can secure their energy needs without holding vast reserves of Western currency, the entire foundation of sovereign debt collapses. The artificial demand that sustained the printing presses for decades is evaporating. We are witnessing the real-time disassembly of a financial empire driven by cold, unforgiving mathematics and sheer survival instinct. Listen to the roar of that Shanghai trading floor again. That is not just the sound of emerging markets doing business. That is the sound of an irreversible chain reaction. Every new bilateral swap is another severed tentacle of the old regulatory kraken. The official narrative desperately insists that the greenback is invincible, that the sanctions are working. But the numbers flashing across those terminal screens expose this as a terminal delusion. The patient is already bleeding out. The architects of this rebellion understood that you cannot kill a centralized network by attacking its center. You destroy it by rendering its center completely obsolete. The Hydra effect is fully operational. They have cut the mandatory routing to New York, and 1,000 independent, localized connections have rapidly grown in its place. The barter system was merely the slow, clumsy beginning. Now the resistance is preparing to digitize this weaponry and execute a quantum leap.
Those bilateral currency swaps we just witnessed, they were a necessary mutation, but they possessed a fatal logistical flaw: time. Moving local currencies between emerging markets was like shipping physical gold on a wooden galleon. It was too clumsy, too slow for the algorithms of modern warfare. The logistics of the resistance were vulnerable, and vulnerability in this new financial war means sudden death. Step into the sterile, freezing environment of a hyper-modern data center. Endless rows of server racks blink rapidly in the darkness. Through the eyes of the exhausted blockchain architect, this is not a server farm. This is the new front line. There is no physical cargo here, only the deafening hum of cooling fans masking the creation of perfect cryptographic trust. This is where the vulnerability of time is annihilated. You were taught in high school economics that money is an object, a tangible asset. You were wrong. Money is merely a protocol for trust, and traditional trust takes time. The SWIFT system requires 3 days to verify this trust across borders. 3 long days where your capital hangs in the void, completely exposed to an American political kill switch. That delay is not a feature. It is a profound weakness. This leads us to the quantum leap of money. Ask yourself, what happens when the speed of a global transaction drops from 3 agonizing days to strictly under 10 seconds? This is not a routine software patch or a minor banking upgrade. This is an irreversible process, a weapon of mass financial destruction aimed directly at the heart of the old world order. To the architect intensely watching the monitors, those 72 hours of traditional processing time are an unacceptable operational flaw. If a transaction takes 3 days to clear, a sudden treasury sanction can freeze it in hour 2. To truly defeat the panopticon, the resistance realized they did not need a better bank. They had to break the fundamental physics of financial time. The technological solution was Project M-Bridge. This was not some speculative cryptocurrency fad designed for day traders. It emerged as the ultimate weapon against SWIFT, a multi-central bank digital currency platform. It utilizes a sovereign distributed ledger technology designed specifically to circumvent the archaic, heavily monitored correspondent banking system of the West. The architect watches the fresh code compile, effectively replacing human bureaucrats and centralized clearinghouses with pure mathematics. Project M-Bridge violently compresses the cross-border transfer time from several days down to strictly under 10 seconds. The bureaucratic lag of the empire has been mathematically exploited and ruthlessly eliminated from the equation. 10 seconds. Think about the terrifying geopolitical implications of that specific number. Before an intelligence analyst in Washington can even finish typing out a sanction order, the target capital has already crossed the globe, cleared, and permanently settled. The threat of freezing assets becomes a mathematically meaningless gesture when the money moves faster than human thought. But how do you guarantee absolute trust without an American middleman looking over your shoulder to verify the ledger? Look closely at the terminal screen in this sterile room. You are witnessing an atomic swap. 2 distinct blocks of sovereign code are instantly trading places on the monitor. There are no brokers. There are no clearinghouses. There are 0 delays. By utilizing smart contracts for atomic settlement, the network guarantees that the exchange of assets happens simultaneously. There is no agonizing waiting period and absolute 0 counterparty risk. If one side of the digital handshake fails for any reason, the entire transaction mathematically ceases to exist before it even begins. It is flawless execution. This elegant logic mathematically eliminates the settlement risk that kept the Global South chained to Wall Street for over 50 years. It completely bypasses the need for American correspondent banks to act as the world's financial police. The dollar is not being defeated by a better currency. It is being bypassed by a vastly superior routing algorithm. Sanctions are officially obsolete.
I want you to deeply grasp the sheer scale of this technological subversion. An entire empire's geopolitical strategy has just been rendered useless by 10 seconds of code. If this mathematical coup blows your mind too, hit the like button right now. To ensure you do not miss the final solution to this cryptographic mystery, subscribe and tell me in the comments, did the old system ever stand a chance? The blinking lights of the server racks reflect in the architect's exhausted, bloodshot eyes. Every single flashing LED represents another massive transaction that the United States Treasury cannot see, cannot stop, and cannot sanction. The digital quarantine has been permanently breached, and the ghost ledger is now operating smoothly at the speed of light. You are programmed to blindly believe that the financial world order is protected by aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, and missile defense systems. But the real shield was always the swift messaging protocol. Now, that invisible monopoly has shattered into a billion untraceable digital fragments, scattering across the servers of the global south. The quantum leap is complete, and the velocity of money has been weaponized. But digital code, no matter how impossibly fast or mathematically flawless, is still just electricity and human logic. To survive the inevitable economic blowback, this new algorithmic ecosystem required a physical tether. It desperately needed an anchor in the real world. You assumed the financial revolution would remain entirely in the cloud, an ethereal network of code and electricity. You were wrong. An algorithm, no matter how mathematically flawless, cannot bleed, cannot starve, and ultimately cannot be held in your hand. The digital ledger was vulnerable to a crisis of faith. Right now, a tangible counteroffensive is quietly accumulating weight beneath the earth, anchoring the digital ghost to the heaviest element of wealth. The financial warfare analyst watches satellite feeds from deep inside a windowless facility. The screens do not show server farms or data centers. Instead, the optics track heavily armored convoys disappearing into subterranean vaults across the global south. The analyst observes forklifts straining under the immense density of metal pallets. They realize this is not a routine transfer. It is a massive stockpiling of survival rations for an impending economic winter. This presents a terrifying paradox that directly challenges your textbook understanding of modern economics. Why is the most advanced digital network in human history suddenly hoarding an ancient primitive metal? Why are the architects of the 10-second atomic settlement violently tethering their weightless algorithms to cold, heavy bullion? The anomaly defies the official narrative of a purely digital future, revealing a massive blind spot in Western strategic thinking. The answer is found in the raw data crossing the analyst's desk. To establish absolute trust in a network completely devoid of the United States dollar, participating central banks began aggressively amassing physical gold. They are purchasing it at a rate not seen since the year 1967. In the year 2022 alone, these rogue institutions removed over 1,000 tons of bullion from the open market, locking it away in sovereign darkness. You were told that gold was a barbarous relic, a shiny rock for paranoid conspiracy theorists. That official narrative was a dangerous myth designed to keep you compliant. For the engineers of this new economic order, that ancient metal is the ultimate cryptographic key. It cannot be printed on a whim by a panicked politician, and it cannot be deleted by an arbitrary executive order from Washington. It is the only asset that globally holds zero counterparty risk.
The analyst maps these gold reserves against the nodes of the Mbridge digital ledger, and the terrifying architecture of the trap finally snaps into focus. The billions of transactions bypassing the SWIFT network are no longer just floating in an algorithmic void. This strategic, relentless hoarding has quietly resurrected an archaic financial mechanism, upgrading it with lethal, modern efficiency. They have engineered a shadow gold standard, operating entirely in the dark. Every instantaneous transaction logged on the distributed ledger is now increasingly backed by the implied value of these physical commodities. The center of financial gravity is violently shifting right beneath your feet. The foundational anchor of global wealth is transitioning away from the fragile promise of American sovereign debt, reverting back to raw, immutable planetary resources. The digital token is just the messenger. The physical metal is the irrefutable truth. This is a synchronized, mathematical assault on the concept of fiat currency itself. The analyst stares at the plunging reserve ratios, watching the undeniable physics of this new reality take hold. By fusing the bleeding-edge speed of algorithmic routing with the heavy, undeniable mass of gold, the emerging superpower alliance has constructed a financial fortress. They are building a system fundamentally designed to survive the catastrophic collapse of the old order. By tying their lightning-fast digital algorithm to a scarce physical asset, the alliance has effectively immunized their new network against arbitrary digital inflation. You are currently trapped in an economy where a central bank can print trillions of dollars over a weekend, silently stealing your purchasing power. But in this shadow ledger, creating fake liquidity is mathematically and physically impossible. They've introduced a strict, unforgiving financial physics. The United States Treasury can no longer manipulate global trade through endless money printing. You cannot print a ton of gold, and you cannot force a mathematically backed ledger to accept a worthless paper promise. The analyst realizes the ultimate checkmate. The weaponized dollar has been neutralized not by a competing fiat currency, but by the undeniable laws of thermodynamics applied to global finance. The West is suddenly playing a game where the old cheat codes fail. This physical tether guarantees that when the legacy financial bubbles inevitably burst, the wealth locked inside the shadow system will remain entirely intact. The Global South is not merely seeking an alternative method of payment. They are methodically engineering a lifeboat. The heavy steel vault doors closing in Moscow and Beijing are the definitive sound of global trust being locked away, secured by mathematics, and grounded in the heavy elements of the earth. Your savings account, your retirement fund, the very stability of the society you live in, everything is currently leveraged on the assumption that the dollar remains unchallenged. But the data on the analyst's screen proves that this assumption is a fatal miscalculation. The foundation of your reality is being systematically replaced by a hybrid system of code and bullion designed to be perfectly immune to the desperate monetary policy of a rapidly declining empire. The trap has been set, the algorithms are locked, and the vaults are full. The massive kinetic energy of global trade is no longer tethered to Western servers. The analyst reaches for the secure phone, knowing the warning comes entirely too late. The invisible shield protecting your economy has not just been bypassed, it has been fundamentally rendered obsolete. And now, the catastrophic mathematical blowback of losing reserve status is finally coming straight home. I have seen the panic in their eyes. The catastrophic blowback is no longer a theoretical projection. It is happening right now, deep inside a windowless conference room in Washington. A forensic analyst stares at a plunging red line on a crumpled printout, his cold coffee completely forgotten. Outside, the Capitol dome glows against the night sky, utterly oblivious to the mathematical collapse occurring just blocks away. You always assumed the empire would fall to an invading army. You were wrong. We are taught that financial sanctions are a strictly one-way street. You fire the weapon, the target suffers, and you go back to sleep wrapped in the security of the global reserve currency. But physics dictates that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The Treasury Department is currently experiencing the ultimate boomerang effect. When you throw a weapon of mass financial destruction, you must be absolutely certain it does not circle back to strike your own foundation.
The analyst circles that plunging red line with a heavy marker. The ink bleeds through the paper, perfectly mirroring the hemorrhage of American financial supremacy. He is looking at the percentage of global foreign exchange reserves held in United States dollars. For decades, this number was the undisputed gravity holding your reality together. In the year 2000, it sat at an unshakable 72%. The world was forced to buy our debt just to survive. That era is over. Today, that vital macroeconomic metric has plummeted to under 58%, and the descent is aggressively accelerating. The analyst rubs his eyes, feeling the sheer vertigo of an empire losing its anchor. A drop of 14% might sound trivial to a layman, but in the brutal architecture of global finance, 14% represents trillions of dollars abandoning a sinking ship. This is not a market correction. This is an evacuation. And nobody sounded the alarm. The true terror in this Washington room is not just the loss of dominance. It is the absolute, terrifying blindness. The velocity of money within the new shadow network has completely outpaced the Treasury's ability to track it. For half a century, the United States acted as the all-seeing eye of global trade. Every transaction passed through our servers. But when you force half the planet onto a dark, distributed ledger, you voluntarily gouge out your own eyes. Because these new transactions occur strictly outside the legacy protocols we control, our visibility is absolute zero. The analyst watches the ghosts in the machine moving massive capital entirely undetected. Traditional economic sanctions, the favorite blunt instrument of Western foreign policy, have been rendered mathematically null and void. You cannot freeze an asset you cannot see. You cannot sanction a wallet that exists entirely outside your jurisdictional universe. I have watched politicians lie about the mechanics of inflation for my entire career. You have been programmed to believe that rising prices are just a natural side effect of a growing economy. That is a comforting myth fed to a gullible public. The brutal reality is that inflation is a domestic virus. For 50 years, the United States possessed the unique ability to sneeze that virus onto the rest of the world. We printed endless trillions, and foreign central banks absorbed the blowback. But as global demand for the dollar abruptly drops, that vital safety valve slams shut. The United States is suddenly facing an unprecedented liquidity crisis. Without foreign nations eagerly buying American debt to fund their international trade, the mathematical reality of our domestic inflation becomes impossible to export. The trillions we printed are now violently trapped inside our own borders. The economic virus has nowhere to go but straight into your bank account. The analyst drops the marker on the table. The sharp clatter echoes in the dead silence of the room. He understands exactly what this means for you. When the empire can no longer export its inflation,
the cost of your groceries, your fuel, and your housing explodes exponentially. Your purchasing power evaporates not by accident, but by a forced mathematical reversion to the mean. The privilege of living beyond our means has been brutally revoked by a global network of algorithms. Look out the window at the brightly lit monuments of Washington. They project a flawless illusion of permanent stability, but the foundation beneath them is rapidly liquefying. Every second the clock ticks, another atomic swap occurs on a foreign distributed ledger. Every second, another ounce of gold is vaulted in Asia to back a digital token that bypasses New York entirely. The financial coup is happening in absolute silence, at the speed of light, while the ruling class argues over optics. Our leaders arrogantly assumed the rest of the world would simply tolerate financial weaponization forever. They believed the dollar was an immutable law of nature, much like gravity. But money is not gravity. It is merely a technology. And technologies become obsolete the very moment a more efficient alternative achieves critical mass. The supreme tragedy is that we funded the research and development of our adversaries by forcing them to innovate or die under the weight of our sanctions. The analyst sweeps the crumpled charts into a secure disposal bin. There is no policy paper that can fix a shattered mathematical paradigm. You cannot legislate a distributed network out of existence. When foreign central banks stop holding your paper debt, the interest rates required to keep the government functioning will skyrocket. It is a mathematical death spiral, triggered entirely by our own hubris. The system isn't failing. It is functioning exactly as the new physics dictate. A sealed room slowly losing oxygen offers no immediate warning. The occupants simply feel a creeping lethargy, a mysterious inability to function. By the time the alarms finally sound, the physiological collapse is irreversible. That is the exact reality of de-dollarization inside the imperial core. Global liquidity is silently draining away, migrating to a shadow system we cannot touch. The average citizen is left suffocating, wondering why their lifelong labor is suddenly worthless. You were told that your wealth was protected by the most powerful military and economy in human history. That was a grand illusion. Your wealth was actually protected by a fragile monopoly on international transactions. Now that the monopoly has been shattered by cryptographic ledgers and sovereign gold, the true bill is coming due. The analyst locks his workstation, plunging his corner of the room into darkness. He knows the mathematical reckoning cannot be reasoned with or stopped. The boomerang is no longer in the air. It has already struck the foundation. The panicked realization inside the treasury is merely the first tremor of the coming earthquake. Because an alternative financial system does not just slowly bleed its competitor. As we are about to discover, the physics of algorithmic trading dictate that once a specific liquidity threshold is breached, the old network does not slowly decline. It experiences a sudden, violent, and absolute structural failure. The earthquake hitting the treasury was not political. It was purely mathematical. Look at this global heat map of trade routes. You are accustomed to seeing a blindingly bright constellation centered entirely on New York. Every transaction, every barrel of oil, every shipment of grain lighting up the transatlantic fiber optic cables. But right now, on this screen, the traditional hubs are dimming. We are witnessing the exact microsecond a global paradigm violently shifts its axis. You were taught in university macroeconomics that reserve currencies die slowly, fading over decades as empires peacefully decline. I am telling you that your textbooks are obsolete. In the hyper-connected architecture of modern finance, networks do not peacefully bleed out. They suffer catastrophic, instantaneous abandonment. This is the vertigo of the tipping point. The exact moment an underground anomaly violently erupts to become the new apex predator of the global standard.
Watch the southern hemisphere on our map. A new, terrifyingly vibrant web of pulsing light is detonating across Asia, the Middle East, and the global south. This is not a gradual transition. It is a mass exodus. The anomaly we tracked from a dusty Tehran server room to the vaults of sovereign gold has breached the containment zone. The question is no longer if the old system will survive, but at what precise mathematical threshold it becomes completely irrelevant to human survival.
The answer lies in the unforgiving laws of network dynamics. A parallel system remains a mere curiosity until it achieves a specific density of mass. The critical threshold for the expanded BRICS coalition was an exact mathematical equation, not a political treaty. The tipping point was breached the moment the total volume of trade settled in their local, sovereign currencies exceeded 25% of their combined gross domestic product.
25%. That is the magic number where a closed-loop alternative ceases to be a rebellion and becomes a gravity well.
You might think this transition requires ideological alignment, a shared hatred for Western hegemony. You are fundamentally wrong. Markets do not have emotions. They do not care about democracy or autocracy. They care exclusively about survival and the ruthless optimization of energy flow. And the energy flow just found a path of lesser resistance.
We must analyze the physics of algorithmic trading. In the subterranean data centers routing trillions of dollars of global commerce, liquidity acts as a supermassive black hole. Liquidity irresistibly attracts more liquidity. Once the 25% threshold was breached in the shadow network, the automated high-frequency routing protocols of global trade triggered a hard-coded reflex. They began defaulting to the cheapest, fastest path available. Those algorithms scanned the global architecture and realized a terrifying truth for the American empire. The legacy SWIFT network, with its correspondent banking fees, multi-day delays, and constant threat of geopolitical freezing, was suddenly the most inefficient route on the planet. The machines did not hold a vote. They simply rerouted the lifeblood of human civilization away from the Atlantic corridor, funneling it directly into the new, instantaneous digital bridges. Look back at the heat map as the lights over Manhattan flicker and fade. This automated rerouting caused a cascading, unstoppable liquidity drain from Western financial institutions. We're talking about trillions of dollars of intrinsic value migrating across the digital divide in the blink of an eye. The capital hemorrhage was not driven by anti-American propaganda. It was driven entirely by the cold, hard, undisputed logic of algorithmic efficiency and reduced friction.
Every fraction of a cent saved on a cross-border transaction through the alternative digital ledger compounds exponentially. The Western panopticon built its power on taxing the movement of money, assuming the world had no other choice but to pay the toll. But the moment the toll booth became optional, the traffic vanished. The sheer speed of this capital flight is breaking the mathematical models used by central bankers in London, Frankfurt, and Washington.
You believe your bank deposits and stock portfolios are insulated from this geopolitical shift. This is the most dangerous cognitive bias you possess. The value of your domestic currency relies completely on its absolute necessity in the international arena. When the automated trading systems of the world relegate your currency to a secondary, inefficient option,
The invisible shield protecting your purchasing power disintegrates. The inflation you feel is just the symptom. The glowing web connecting the global south is thickening, pulsing with the raw kinetic energy of commodities and microchips, flowing without Western oversight. This is a planetary-scale margin call. Western institutions are suddenly holding vast reserves of debt that the rest of the world no longer needs to buy to facilitate trade. The structural failure is happening right in front of our eyes, hidden beneath layers of complex cryptographic code and bilateral currency swaps. The dominoes are falling with terrifying precision. An importer in Mumbai buys oil from a terminal in the Persian Gulf. The transaction settles in milliseconds via the new digital ledger, backed by sovereign gold, bypassing New York completely. In that exact fraction of a second, a tiny sliver of American financial supremacy is permanently erased. Now, multiply that single invisible transaction by millions, happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There is no diplomatic summit that can reverse this algorithm. You cannot bomb a distributed consensus mechanism. You cannot sanction a network that has already mathematically excluded you from its architecture. The trap our leaders unwittingly set for their adversaries has snapped shut on their own economies. By weaponizing the monopoly, they proved to the global market that the monopoly was a single point of failure, and the market ruthlessly engineered it out of existence. As the global map reorients itself, the old world order is left holding a fistful of outdated maps. The center of financial gravity has definitively shifted eastward and southward, pulled by the inescapable magnetism of physical commodities and frictionless digital clearing. We are standing at ground zero of an invisible apocalypse, watching the financial architecture of the 20th century crumble into dust under the weight of superior, decentralized mathematics. The tipping point is no longer a theoretical projection on a whiteboard in the Treasury Department. It is the new, unyielding reality of the global economy. The alternative is now the standard. The shadows have become the substance. And as the lights of the legacy system finally blink out, the West is about to wake up in a completely unrecognizable world, stripped of the one supreme advantage that financed its empire. The era of the weaponized dollar has violently ended. The sun rises over the megacities of the global south, illuminating skylines built not on American debt, but on decentralized cryptographic consensus. Cranes swing in rhythmic precision, drones trace silent paths across the smog, and the economy hums with terrifying efficiency. Thousands of miles away, in a forgotten data center in the West, an ancient server rack quietly powers down. The old world is going dark, unmourned and obsolete. I have watched this transition unfold over the last hour, tracking the invisible flow of capital from sanctioned basements to sovereign vaults. We analyzed this through the lens of forensic warfare, treating the collapse of the dollar as a geopolitical murder mystery. But the truth is far colder. There was no assassination. We are simply witnessing the ruthless, undeniable law of financial Darwinism playing out in real time. The demise of the SWIFT messaging system was never a coordinated attack by foreign adversaries. It was an inevitable evolutionary obsolescence. By attempting to use a neutral communication protocol as a weapon of geopolitical control, our architects committed a fatal biological error. They introduced an existential threat to the ecosystem, inadvertently forcing the global economy to develop a decentralized immune response. When we started this investigation, we believed economic isolation was an absolute weapon. We thought severing a nation from the New York routing hub was a death sentence. But you have seen the mutation firsthand. From the clumsy European barter ledgers to the relentless momentum of bilateral currency swaps among emerging markets, the algorithm found a way. The blockade did not starve the adversaries. It educated them. We assumed that power resided in the printing press, in the ability to project military force to secure oil contracts. But the true power lay in the friction of the transaction. By forcing the world to build an alternative out of sheer desperation, we accelerated the arrival of atomic digital settlements. We pushed the transaction time from 3 agonizing days down to strictly under 10 seconds. We engineered our own irrelevance. The mathematical reality you are looking at today is a landscape of multipolar financial physics. Economic supremacy is no longer derived from a centralized server sitting securely in the West, dictating terms to the periphery. The global center of gravity has been violently redistributed. The ledger of history has been rewritten in cryptographic code that does not recognize our borders, our jurisdictions, or our sanctions. This is the paradox of absolute power that every empire eventually fails to grasp. When you control the only bridge between nations, you feel invincible. But the moment you start charging an ideological toll to cross that bridge, you give the world the ultimate financial incentive to invent the airplane. And once the airplane is invented, nobody ever goes back to paying the toll. The infrastructure of tomorrow bypasses us entirely. The homework I'm giving you is to look at the currency in your pocket, not as a guarantee of value, but as a historical artifact. We printed paper and demanded the world trade its sweat and commodities for it. But the world woke up. You are living through the exact moment when the timeline split, when the unquestioned axiom of American economic supremacy collapsed under the weight of superior, frictionless mathematics. The new architecture of global wealth is ruthlessly pragmatic. It is based on a distributed consensus of mathematics, anchored firmly by raw, immutable planetary resources. The central banks that abandoned our network did not replace it with another fiat illusion. They secured it with thousands of tons of physical gold. They tied the speed of light to the heaviest element, creating an ecosystem we can no longer manipulate. So what does this mean for us, sitting in the fading twilight of a financial empire? It means the bill has finally come due. The inflation we used to export to developing nations is now trapped within our own borders. The weaponized dollar did not die in a fiery apocalyptic crash. It simply became technologically and geopolitically irrelevant. It was starved of oxygen by a global market that realized it had better options. Understanding this shift is no longer an academic exercise. It is a prerequisite for surviving the coming decade. If this investigation shattered your illusions and gave you a new lens to view the collapsing order, hit the like button. That is how we confirm we are decoding the right signals in the noise. Subscribe and join the research grid, because the old maps are burning, and we have to chart this new reality together. The timer has officially hit 0, and the explosion happened in complete silence. We survived the detonation, but the world we woke up in belongs to someone else. The algorithms will continue to route capital along the paths of least resistance. The massive freighters will continue to cross the oceans, settling their ledgers in digital currencies we cannot track, cannot tax, and cannot stop. The quarantine is permanent. You cannot negotiate with mathematical certainty, and you cannot reverse an evolutionary leap. We built the ultimate financial panopticon, only to realize we had securely locked ourselves inside, while the rest of the planet simply walked away. The empire was not conquered by a foreign army. It was quietly rendered obsolete by a superior string of code. Adapt to this new reality, or become a fossil. Class dismissed.